We're live. Hello, everyone. Thank you for showing up to watch, whether you're here live or whether you're going to show up later and watch on the stream. I want to start by saying two things. One, well, maybe three things, like two and a half things. The one is that a friend of mine, Blaze, and this is something that I think you both have heard me say before, Doug and Sable, and it's not something that I came up with. It's a friend of mine, Blaze, is that Ridley Scott either makes the most miraculous genre-defining film or he lands with a thud and it's kind of a flop. So for this movie, I'm in the latter camp. And that's the 0.5, the half thing that I have to say is that I kind of lied to you guys. I said, Last Duel, it's a great movie. We should watch it. It's going to be great. And I actually think it's Rashomon, but worse.
It's
Rashomon, but worse.
I was thinking about that comparison myself.
Yeah. So I really think that Ridley Scott took a look at Rashomon, and I don't want to put thoughts in his head, but that's exactly what he did. I think he read the book and then he modeled the film on Rashomon. The book, which I have not read, but I have read a couple of synopsises on. It's by a guy named Jager or Jager.
Yep, I got it right here. Eric Jager.
Yeah. So I've read a couple of synopsises. I haven't actually read the book, but from what I understand, and this could be wrong, it could just be a miscommunication in what I've read. I haven't, by no means have I read everything exhaustively. Oh, hey, Heath.
Heath, what's up, man?
But it seems like the whole unreliable account is not in the book. It's something that was put into the film. Which is totally fine, but I really struggled with the message applied as Ridley Scott applied it. So essentially, the message of Rashomon, which ends up being the message of this film, which is unfortunately directly stated, but the message of Rashomon is that the truth doesn't matter, right? You can have five, I think, differing accounts of true events that all could conflict with one another. And so you completely lose the truth. Truth is completely occluded. But what matters is how you choose to conduct yourself in any given moment, provided your perspective. So he definitely approaches this in the film, but he does so, in my view, a more focused way to a very specific type of situation that is not incorrect, but he doesn't do it maybe as delicately as he should.
Right.
And I feel like in general, for having focused the message, it loses something. That's my, grand preamble. I'm starting from a place of, I don't really like this movie. I love the acting. Like Matt Damon is incredible. I think that Adam Driver, the nuance in the different accounts. So when you go through the three different accounts and you see the difference in attitude, the difference in demeanor, the small, subtle little changes, like really, really great acting, and they pulled down really great actors for it. But period dress is off a little bit, armor is off a little bit.
Yep.
And so it's, it's a Hollywoodized sort of, medieval era France. I think the history is neat, right? So it is actually definitively the last recorded trial by combat in history.
It's not.
I think that. Say again.
It's not actually. There was one that was a couple of hundred years ago.
It's the last one in France.
Well, last one in France. Yeah, pardon me.
Right.
Not right. Last one in France in recorded history.
Right,
Pardon me.
right.
I misspoke. But it's a very interesting tale, but it's one that ultimately, in my view, doesn't land. And it's because of the parallels I can draw to Rashomon, and it's because of the hyper specificity of the message. and that's not even really it. It's that in tandem with the indelicateness of
Right.
the communication.
Well, I one thing that stood out to me playing into that exact thing, which I think critically weakened the film, was you have the two chapters. You have the truth according to Jean de however you pronounce it, Carouge. Jean de Carouge. Chapter 1, the truth according to Jean de Carouge. Then chapter 2, the truth according to Jacques de Gris. Which is the coolest name ever, by the way. That translates to Jack the Gray. Yeah. Jack the Gray is a fantastic name. Anyway, so the truth according to Jacques de Gris is chapter 2. And then chapter 3, the truth according to Marguerite. And as it fades out, the truth stays on the screen longer than the rest of the text. And I'm like, okay, you just undercut. Because halfway through, I'm like, oh, he's doing a Rashomon. Okay, fine. But you just undercut the entire point of that message.
Yes, absolutely. Beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Like, okay, the truth, like, okay, we're going to tell you who's actually relating the actual story of what the actual events,
Additionally, like
this one is now, we are placing this one as premier in importance, as having more weight than the other two.
Yes. Yeah. I guess before we continue, just a warning: we're going to be discussing sexual assault and rape. It's a part of the film. It's a large part of the film. So, fair warning. That's where this conversation is headed. But
and total spoilers
with regard to the truth that Marguerite gives, like even in her account, things are misremembered. She'll remember someone else saying something that someone said, or she'll remember her own self saying something that someone else had actually said in her own account.
Yeah.
And so
she doesn't even refer to a conversation across the sideboard that was the one where supposedly Jacques de Gris became smitten with her in the first place. Did she just forget about that?
Yes. Yes.
So
now I agree with you guys on that core issue that if you're going to do a multiple perspective, where's the truth? Maybe it's somewhere in the middle type of approach, the Rashomon approach, right? That's only effective if we take at face value all the perspectives and we see that there's conflicts in there, and it makes it difficult they're all unreliable narrators is what that breaks down to.
Yes.
So when you take one and say, well, here's the account that's reliable, then why bother with the first two?
Exactly. Why are you wasting my time? Exactly.
I 100% agree with that. Just tell me her story then, because if you're going to present this as here's a reliable narrator and here's two unreliable narrators,
just make it a story from her perspective the entire time.
Just tell me the story from start to finish. Yep. Completely agree.
So that would have hit very differently and much.
It would have been way more poignant.
Yeah.
To the message that I think that he was trying to speak to, for sure.
Well, definitely. And I think you could still try to incorporate what they tried to do, which is show how something can be remembered different ways. Like you could have her telling her, you just show us the events, and with her as like a point of view anchor, right? And you could do this through film work very easily. And then suddenly she decides she wants to press this into trial. He decides to do it. And then during the testimonies, you could have flashbacks that start to conflict. And she's like, that's not what happened, and he's like, that's exactly what happened. So you could still get that point across that maybe, or especially if you have her go, oh, wait a minute, I did talk to him that one time and I forgot to say that. And then you see a bunch of guys being like, oh, so now you don't remember. And does that undermine the other details of her story or not? So you could have done
courtroom drama. It could have been.
Right. A courtroom drama, I think, is what they should have done. Now, that said, there's a lot to like in this movie, too. I did feel like I was treated to a very good, at like a strong medieval story. Like the 1300s do feel pretty heavy on this. I thought the visuals were very good. I think, James,
definitely.
you already said it. The acting was actually incredible. And I would say Adam Driver, who I'm not, I'm very neutral on him. I'm not anti or anything, but I thought he was exceptional.
He's a fantastic actor.
I think that he is absolutely amazing in everything except for Star Wars.
Yeah, exactly.
And I don't think that's his fault. I don't think Star Wars is his fault at all.
No. I don't blame any of those actors.
He's an
for Star
outstanding
Wars.
actor.
Mm-hmm.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, if we were given that script for a read through, I think the best thing we could do is say, let me talk to my agent one more time. But yeah, so the acting was exceptional. I'll even say that Ben Affleck was good, but man, it took me an hour to get used to seeing him in blonde hair. He was so distracting to me. And I've heard other people say he was excellent. I'm like, well, he was kind of excellent because he did a good job acting, but all I could see was Ben Affleck. It really took me a while before I realized that I didn't think I was looking at Ben Affleck, where I had become invested in his character.
Ben Affleck has a very, I'll call it a standard sort of Ben Affleck delivery, right? So like,
yeah,
he's just very Ben Affleck in most of the roles that he's in. I think this is,
I was thinking,
this is the biggest jerk he's been since like Mallrats, which I really enjoyed because I think he plays a fantastic bad guy. Not that he is an antagonist, right? But he's not the antagonist because we're seeing it from a bunch of different perspectives. I thought he was great in the movie, but I agree with you. It was still kind of just like Ben Affleck blonde with a bowl cut, which felt a little off at first.
Well, it was hard for me to get lost in the film because it was like, oh my God, it's 1380 and there's Ben Affleck. And then you can get settled again. You know, once you get past that initial, like, there's Ben Affleck, I would get reabsorbed into this film, but there was a constant Ben, bleach blonde Ben, like it just kept sticking with me.
Very funny.
My reaction was a little different at first. I was like, wait, is that Ben Affleck? Because I didn't realize he was in the film. I didn't recognize him from the poster, and then his delivery was like, is that Ben Affleck? Oh yeah, okay, I guess that is Ben Affleck. But it didn't take me out just because I was having similar thoughts to you, Bacon, where it's like either Ben Affleck can be like pretty good, or he can just phone it in. And a lot of the times he just phones it in, and he's just Ben Affleck. This is one of the films where I felt like he was not phoning it in. He was not playing Ben Affleck. He was Ben Affleck playing
Pierre. What was his name?
Playing
Pierre, I think, right?
Yeah, Pierre. Yeah, and I thought he did. I mean, he was a haughty drunkard. That's what he was.
Yeah, he was,
and he played it off pretty well.
I thought he did play it off very well. Like I said, the problem was the brand recognition. I could just immediately, but like I said, that's not his fault necessarily. And the fact that he was cast in this role, I thought he did a really good job. And the one thing that I really applaud this film for was I began to appreciate scenarios that I would never be in because the medieval times have moved on. Like, I don't have to worry about dowries or estates or a lord issuing this or, like these scenarios are not modern scenarios. So to put me there and have him with some of the camera work where he's like, "You are a sycophant, sir." And he's just sitting there kind of, I'm like, like I feel that, like I see what is bothering him. And, I felt like the world was functional. I always like to talk about functionality, the sense that the world seems to make sense. And I got that here in this movie. So I thought they delivered a genuinely medieval scenario and delivered that well. I thought that landed. So it was almost like they could have gone with the courtroom drama from Marguerite's perspective and just say, hey, this is what it is. And there's distorting points of view. Or they could have just gone with these guys and the dispute that they were having, because that I thought was pretty dramatic by itself. This friendship that fell apart, where this cunning but inferior squire rises to prominence to the point where he's overshadowing this genuinely brave knight who has the favor of the king, but the king's not here, kind of thing. So I don't know. I thought that was all pretty dramatic just by itself.
Did either of you guys have either of you guys seen The Duelists?
No,
I have not.
Oh, okay. That's too bad. Because I was wondering, because The Duelists is Ridley Scott's premiere film, right? He did it in 1977, 2 years before Alien.
Okay,
it's what put him on the map, and very well done film.
that's right. I remember that.
Harvey Keitel.
It's and Keith Carradine.
I need to see this. I don't know how I've not seen this.
It's got some. I became aware of it just because it's got some incredibly accurately done fight scenes, which was pretty. Which, anyway, it's actually what I thought up until up until 2/3 of the film, maybe a little past halfway for the Last Duel here. I kind of thought, I wonder if this is Ridley Scott returning to the well, so to speak, because that film is also about two men who are continually at each other's throats, and the reason they're called the duelists is because they fight 4 duels over the course of like 15, 20 years or something like that throughout. It's in Napoleonic France. Similar idea, right?
He really likes France. He really likes France.
Yeah, and so I was like, there's an awful lot of similarities here going through. It ultimately turns out to be a very different film, but at the same time, it's this period piece. It's about 2 guys who are constantly kind of at each other's throats, and the main difference between that one is it's told in entirely chronological order, and there is a single point of view character. Keith Carradine's character is the point of view. That one as well was also based on historical events, based on real people. Although in this film, in the Last Duel, the people are named their actual names, whereas in the Duelists, they changed the names of the characters, even though they were representing real people.
Oh, interesting.
Anyway, so there's some interesting parallels. Very much, both of them have a similar feel because they're both Ridley Scott doing Ridley Scott things. Both have very sumptuous period piece, costuming and all that. Both of them have a lot of play with light and dark in a lot of scenes. Ridley Scott loves to use lighting dramatically. I felt like, but I think one of the biggest things that stood out to me was that The Duelists feels like a fresh film. It feels like a young director kind of feeling his oats. And a young, maybe not fully experienced director yet, but somebody with a strong vision. Whereas to me, it's like, oh, hey, better take a notice of this guy. He's going to do some things probably. And then guess what?
And then Alien.
He turns out to do some things. All right. But this one, The Duelists, or The Last Duel rather, I almost felt like he was phoning it in more so than any of the actors were. And one of the things that stood out to me is that that kind of exemplified that was, and I don't know if either of you guys caught this, but there's a shot as they're leaving the tournament, the duel, where they must have done it in a reshoot, or maybe the cloudiness, the overcast had cleared off, and so they were filming it in sun, and they just put a night filter over it to match the coloration of the rest of the scene. And it's just like, it's when they're riding off, they're riding the horses from left to right in frame, and Matt Damon's raises his hand to wave to the crowd, and it's just it's like a less than 2-second shot. I don't even know why it got.
Yeah, why even go through the trouble?
Why go through the? Yeah, why go
cut
through? Just cut it. Yeah, I don't understand why that didn't even got through editing in the first place. So it's like, and I was watching it, kind of trying to approach it similar to the Northman. Is it like, how is the shot blocking? Is there anything going on with the camera movements? And there were some outstanding scenes. There was some outstanding framing in a few shots and a few scenes. Lighting, again, he really plays with a lot of darks to make things interesting to look at. But I don't think there's anything else going on as far as subtext goes. It's very utilitarian filmmaking, I thought.
Which is okay.
No, there's nothing wrong with it.
Bad thing. It's just, less developed. To my eye, to my viewership, it's less interesting in that regard.
And especially if you're trying to do it, if you're trying to pull off a story like this, number one, don't make the truth fade out slower for one of your characters. But number two, try and use that directorial skill that we know you have to give import and communicate things beyond what's being just told to us by the characters.
Right.
Give information to the audience that isn't available to somebody who's not watching the movie. Give the audience some non-diegetic information through your filmmaking techniques.
Completely agree. Like, for example,
we know you can do it. You're Ridley freaking Scott.
Those 2 seconds that you saw the filter over.
Yeah.
Just let it be sunny. Let that little inconsistency sort of play in the mind of the audience.
Why not?
Was it sunny? Was it stormy? Like, those are the sorts of things that you can really use to good effect. That
you would almost be highlighting the idea of an inconsistent reality.
Right. Like, they might not have reported in their story, it was a sunny day before, we attacked. But if it is sunny to the audience versus, the next account, it's an overcast versus the next account, it's, it wouldn't be heavily storming, because that's a major inconsistency. But it's just teeny tiny little minor inconsistencies, I think, would have gone a long way to really, A, allow me to dig into the film like I like, and B, kind of, predispose the audience toward this idea that the truth doesn't matter.
Right.
Well, and, on that account too, the weird thing is we have no record of her account. We only have the other 2 accounts. So, it's weird that we have a documented account from this guy, a documented account from that guy, no documented account from her. And they're like, here's the truth. And it's like, well, only in the sense of the movie, because if you're saying these are based on true events, but you don't have her account at all, then you're just saying you're making it up and this is the truth. So that's a little jarring in terms of historical fiction. To claim that you have the truth and that's the least filled in part of the historical documents that you're working with,
And it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, based on a true story is typically the biggest weasel phrase in all of Hollywood.
Right.
Like, you can do whatever you want. It's based on a true story. Like, I took a couple of names that were actually really reported in the historical record, and that's it. But, like, you can get away with a whole lot when you say based on a true story. But like you said, in this particular situation, it becomes a difficulty for the audience to overcome, because we do have the accounts of the other 2 individuals. We don't have her account at all. And to say that you, with a modern eye, literally hundreds of years removed from the situation, can provide the truth of an account it's a bridge too far. It's a bridge too far.
I think the best. So I write historical fiction, and I use
a
lot. Yeah, totally.
Tell us about that, Doug.
It's tough because sometimes you have things that work, but wouldn't work if for example, like in this film, the Notre Dame Cathedral, it looks, the way they film it, it's like it's being constructed, right?
Yes, there's scaffolding and it all. Yeah.
Yeah, like they make it look like, hey, by the way, here's medieval France. Check it out. They're building the Notre Dame Cathedral. I looked it up, and it's built in the 1100s, so they're 200 years off. So that to me would be Now, I ran into a similar problem with my story. Just for an example, I had to describe a church that's really in existence, the Hagia Sophia Church in Istanbul. And
Not
I had to
Constantinople?
describe it the way it was at the time in the story, which is about a decade before it burned to the ground. So anyone who would do any research on the Hagia Sophia would find the church that's there today, and
completely
not the
different.
church- and by the way, and what's even crazier is the church that burned down. There's very little about it anyway, because it was there for about 200 years, and it burned to the ground, and it was replaced by a wonder of almost like an ancient wonder of the world in the Hagia Sophia. So that whatever was there before, no one even cares about. But as a writer, should I describe the one that people will discover when they look it up, or should I? So I can't. But in this film, I'm like, you have an opportunity to drive this home by visuals and everything. And they added a visual that doesn't even exist. So I thought that was an unusual choice, and clearly done for the effect of just saying we're basically in the medieval times.
Yeah.
And we're in France, we're in Paris, and let's just pretend the Notre Dame's being built in the 1300s.
Yeah.
There is a certain type of viewer that isn't bothered by that, right?
But just put it in the background.
Then there are other types of viewers who get super pedantic.
It was bugging me too.
Historical detail, and it's just it removes.
Like, are they building Notre Dame?
It removes me from the ability to watch the movie effectively.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but here's my thought: if you're trying to tell historical fiction, now being a purist is always difficult, right? Because if you're too pure, then it can be hard to resonate with audiences, because you don't do anything to help us understand it sometimes. Like I remember listening to one guy being like, they should have put this whole movie in Greek, and I was like, well, maybe, but you'd really have a tough time connecting to your, that might be a bridge too far in terms of that connection. But my thought is, the Notre Dame was built in the 1100s for a reason. Obviously that was its time. So the fact that it's there for 200 years in the 1380s, well, what's wrong with just showing a 200-year-old cathedral?
Yep.
You're still world building. You're saying we're 200 years into this. Christian, Paris. There's nothing wrong with having it back there without the scaffolds. Like, why? Yeah. Why add the scaffolding and then throw off the historical thing?
Or, it could have been another situation where maybe in one account it has the scaffolding and in another account it doesn't. And that obviously would have deviated drastically from the history of the building, but it would have sort of been a nod from the director to the audience directly. Like, things aren't exactly lining up here in a very sort of subtle background in the distance kind of a way, which would have been totally fine. But it was consistently under construction.
Right, and you can just add one comment and be like, we got to rebuild it because of the fire. You can add a comment or, just to address that for the city. So, and I remember when, now Gladiator is universally beloved for the most part, I would say, a Ridley Scott film. And I realized that he does play a little fast and loose. I remember listening, because I like Gladiator. But I was listening to him do an interview one time. And do you remember the opening scene, which I love, by the way? The opening scene in Gladiator. You got the Roman legions there. You got the barbarian warlord, out there right in front of like the Black Forest. Like, it's really good visual. There's a scene where they're getting ready to fire these arrows with flames on them out into the woods. And there's this little trench in the mud, and they light the trench on fire. There's some sort of like flammable something in there. They all dip their arrows in it, and they shoot it. And I remember being like, oh, wow, I didn't know they could do that. Now, this is
they can't.
This was 25 years ago. I wasn't, I don't think I did any research on it. I was just like, oh, wow, that's interesting. And then I was watching an interview with Ridley Scott, and he goes, so I told him to do it like this. And one of the crew was like, how do we know that the Romans did that? And he goes, how do we know they didn't? And I was like, that's Ridley Scott's answer? How do we know they didn't? So I was like, man, you just made up like a military tactic using a chemical that we don't know I don't know. So it always was guarded on Ridley Scott ever since then, because I think it'd be more interesting to find out what they really did and then depict that. that's just always going to be more interesting to me. I don't know.
He took similar liberties in Napoleon, I think, didn't he?
Fire arrows as a portrayed in Hollywood are completely an invention anyway.
Well, have you ever tried to fire a fire arrow?
Oh yeah, you can't do it. Yeah, that's what I mean. Is like if they're going to set fire to something, you're going to use torches. You're not going to use an arrow.
Yeah. Well, yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. Like anyone who thought of like lighting an arrow on fire and then shooting it, I've done it. Like when I was like 15 or something, I remember I had a bow and we were shooting, and we would light these arrows on fire and we would try to shoot them, and the flame would always go out. So I was like, oh, I guess
you literally leave the fire behind. The fire is just. And in fact,
you smother it.
In fact, shadow. No, it's not even that you smother it. It's just that as soon as you loose the arrow, it's moving so fast. It literally just leaves the fire behind and just.
Well, it's smothered. There's not enough oxygen for it to continue to burn. So it's
yeah.
But I mean, well, there's a, and this is completely. They do have a fire arrow scene in The Last Duel, by the way, and I was like, oh come on. But there's actually who is it? Shadiversity. Shadiversity here on YouTube did a fire arrow experiment, and they filmed it at high speed, and you can actually see them like when they loose the arrow flies and the flame actually stays where it was and continues burning until there's no fuel left for it, and then it just poof disappears in the middle of the air. It's really trippy. Anyway,
so yeah, that's it. Yeah. So,
but yeah, you can't fire a fire arrow. They tried, and they finally got something that would stay hot enough that it would ignite whatever it landed on. But
Todd's Workshop, he's another kind of medieval warfare channel on YouTube. He's done something on fire arrows. I am not familiar with it enough to be able to cite exactly what he did or what the tests were or anything. But if anyone's curious, you can go over to Todd's Workshop. It's actually a really great channel.
Yeah, you could
1D, Todd 1D.
You could theoretically make an arrow that would maintain its heat long enough that if it landed in something flammable like thatch, it could theoretically catch it on fire again. But it wouldn't be, you wouldn't see it flying through the air, flaming like Hollywood arrows do.
You'd have to go back to that time period and imagine logistically how you managed to bring that onto the battlefield and then execute that. I mean, try to convince somebody today to do something difficult and bring some, so like, I don't know, it's stick to the basics. And my belief is for the most part, sticking to reality is going to give an impact. There's something about authenticity, I think, that delivers an impact, even if you can imagine it cooler. It's still that the cooler factor is where the inauthenticity comes from sometimes. And I do think that there's a steady diet of that, and you can actually weaken the story or the film,
especially in a historical context.
Yeah, right. Especially, I tend to agree.
I think he did the same thing in Napoleon. There are some
inconsistencies
there that just really confuse people.
I haven't seen Napoleon, so I couldn't.
I saw it. I didn't hate it. A lot of people hated it, but I'm not a Napoleon guy, so I just didn't know my history the way a lot of my friends do. And those who knew their history just detested the film. And it's another Ridley Scott film.
Right.
I didn't hate it. I keyed into some of the inconsistencies. It was entertaining, but I went into that movie predisposed to just letting him have it because he can be the world's greatest, even though he can land with a thud sometimes. And it seems like his production pace over the past, I think it's been 5 years, has been absolutely breakneck. And I think that we can absolutely tell. We can tell because a lot of it gets phoned in, and he just needs to slow down and write better scripts and tell better stories, right? That aren't Rashomon, but worse.
Yeah, and that's the Last Duel is not a bad film either. Is the thing is
I would actually very entertaining. I would
actually put it forth as the antithesis of that idea that he only makes a banger or he makes a dud. Then you have The Last Duel, which I would say is neither.
You're right.
But I would actually still lean more towards the good than the bad with it.
Right. That's what I was going to say.
It's just it undercuts itself in a few key ways.
Yeah, I think that The Last Duel is a good film that has its flaws. In fact, while watching it last night, I couldn't help but think, and I'll just ask you guys because I'm curious. I think I already know your answers, but to what extent? So this movie came out in 2021.
Mm-hmm.
To what extent do you think that the current political situation impacted the making of this film?
I think COVID impacted it for sure. Well, the release.
Well, COVID impacted
the release of the film. As far as the making of the film,
like the writing of it, the emphasis on the Marguerites as the truth. Because remember, there was the believe women. There was a line of thought. And it's still kind of out there, but it was real heavy there. Especially during the, and I'm not trying to get political. I'm just saying that there's a tie into the pop culture element to the film. When they were doing the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh, I remember that there was this thing called Believe Women, which said that there would be no way that no woman would ever lie about it. And the thinking behind the spirit behind it was, for those women who are coming forward bravely and telling what happened and facing disbelief, doubt, or discreditation, that is in itself a second level of trauma to an already traumatic experience. And to that, I'm very sympathetic. However, to say that no woman would ever lie about it is just fundamentally ridiculous.
Has been.
I'm going to be a jerk here and sack this topic pretty quickly because I don't really like to get political on the channel. But
okay,
I will say that there is definitely messaging in the film for sure that sort of picks that line up and runs with it.
Okay,
for sure. I think that it's certainly there.
I wasn't really going to necessarily touch on it either, other than as far as I think I already have. And I was probably picking up something similar to what you were, because I thought, well, that seems like this film seems a little too current day in its commentary or its presentation for the subject and specifically for the time in which it happened.
Yes.
And again, I would say that one of the biggest and most undercutting elements was the truth fading out slower in Chapter 3 title card.
So
that indicates that kind of I guess social commentary of modern day viewpoint, if you want to put it that way.
Right. That's kind of where I was
going.
All
I'll say for that.
Right. And I'll kind of back more into the writing side of it. But to me, that's where I think that there a mistake may have been made, that there was a line of thought that they tried to follow, and when they tried to adapt that line of thought into a multi-perspective story, they actually messed it up because the line of thought itself had some basic flaws to it. And then when you take a flawed axiom like that and apply it into a story, the story then becomes flawed by default, or by, incidentally.
I know, that's a good point. Yeah. I think that's a worthy point to bring up.
That's all I was going to say. Because in principle, this could have been very, very good if there was equal unreliability, and I think it's actually more thought-provoking if they're like, what do you think happened?
Yeah,
I bet.
Yes, 100%.
Yes, that's what the messaging should be. That's absolutely what it should be.
Don't you think that most of us would have probably sided with Marguerite anyway, like if they didn't?
Sure,
sure.
By default, we're going to have the sympathies, especially since we're switching viewpoints. And from her viewpoint, she is undergoing trauma, and she's sobbing on the bed, and she's like,
"Well, it's compounded trauma. She's experiencing trauma. She's experiencing trauma from both sides."
Exactly.
Right. And there's two tiers of it. You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I completely agree. It was ham-fisted in the delivery. I think establishing that her version of events is the absolute truth is it undermines the message. It undermines,
especially because this is the last duel, right? This is there hasn't been they make a point is there hasn't been an honor duel or a duel of whatever they
trial
call
by combat.
a trial by combat, but a duel of legality, or I forget how they put it. But
Right.
an
There's
actual duel to the death to prove innocence, or to determine the truth, who is telling the truth in a legal matter, right? This hasn't happened for a couple hundred years, if I remember correctly, is what they said.
Yeah.
Um,
They thought it was illegal, but it just had not happened.
And it just hadn't happened for so long that everybody has gone into thinking that it's been outlawed, when it even hasn't. So the whole reason that this is even occurring is because we only have 3 separate people in a he said, she said situation. Nobody else was there. Like the only 2 people for the actual crime were Jacques de Gris and Marguerite. And as a he said, it was literal he said, she said, and nobody can determine the legality of it.
Right.
And there isn't enough information to actually to render a judgment.
Well, which is a major issue even to this day in these
absolutely
situations.
Yes. And so without that aspect of it, then the whole trial wouldn't have happened in the first place, unless you want to tell it in the manner of a feud between the 2 men.
Well, and
that's a different story, right?
Well, that's what I was trying to say. Is that is its own story.
Yeah, it could be absolutely its own story.
They tried to get away with doing that, though, in the portrayal of Marguerite as a possession, as property, as she likely would have been viewed in the time period. And so it was sort of...
Is there nothing you have that he cannot try and take from me? Or whatever.
Right. Yeah. Not only that, but like the way... when he wins the duel, he raises her hand to the crowd to sort of that wasn't for her, that was for him, that was for his glory, so that he could receive all of the accolades for having won the duel, because God had chosen him to win because he's the one that's telling truth. And he didn't even I think, if I'm recalling correctly, and it was 2 days ago when I watched the movie again, but I don't think he even embraces her or anything. He just smiles at her and then turns to the crowd, or he might not even smile. I don't even recall, but that whole, regardless of the detail, the idea is that she is being treated as a commodity by these 2 individuals, and it's kind of like it's a game of push pull. So he tried to tell that story, kind of, but it just fell flat. That particular aspect of the film fell flat. And many other aspects of the film fell flat, in my view, as well. Again, it's an entertaining watch. I would watch it again for sure. But it just, it just is it's a missed mark for me.
But they did, and I thought this was more effective. They did try to show the view, a medieval view of women to some extent, where there's that one scene where he's talking to the Lord about the estate that he wants for the dowry, and she's sitting right there, and they're basically horse trading over her value. And I was like, well, now that's how you do it. You demonstrate something without telling us, and then let us kind of not feel good about the scene as the scene moves on to something else, And then when we see it again, we'll be like, "Oh man, I don't like that. I would hate that." So I thought that was much more effective than some of the other ways they do it. So it shows me that they do know how to do it, but there's this weird pressure on people to be blatant. I don't know.
The first 2, I think I am tracking exactly what you're saying, Doug. I felt like the first 2 chapters were by far the strongest part of this movie. And then the 3rd chapter comes along, and the fact that you hit us over the head with it immediately lowers the impact and the quality of the experience of chapter 3. And up until the point where you actually get back to the duel, which I found to be very intense, but that's because they've set up the rivalry between these 2 men, plus also the consequences to Marguerite if her husband loses, right?
Well, what it's
if her husband's killed, then she dies too. Yeah. And that makes the stakes even more so. Well, but again, even at that point, I was sitting there, I was on the edge of my seat for the fighting itself, but I was also in the back of my mind, I couldn't go with the fact that they've told me who I should be rooting for. They have not let me come to that conclusion myself. And that also weakens that fight from everything else except just a pure spectacle. which is
I
a
agree.
great
And it was a
spectacle.
great-
It was a great,
Very
yes,
well
it was a
done.
great spectacle.
Amazing-
I thought that the
amazingly done
cinematography
fight.
for that duel was fantastic.
Yes, it was an amazingly
It's
done.
pretty
and
brutal.
it was very like it actually reminded me a lot of the if you've seen the fight scene in Henry in The King, the Timothy Chalamet film adaptation of Henry V.
Oh, I have
Um,
not.
No, I haven't. I just haven't watched it yet. Maybe
Okay.
we'll do that one. Maybe, we'll do that. Maybe that'll be one that we schedule. In
So-
fact, let's just schedule it now. We're going to do that one.
That
You know-
that duel, Timothy Chalamet as Henry V has a duel in that film very similar to this one,
Wow.
in a lot of ways, even down to the point where they're rolling in the mud trying to shove poniards through the gaps in each other's armor, right?
Yeah.
Which is going to be what has to happen because you're essentially the tank of the day. You are an armored vehicle, and you can't be harmed by standard weaponry.
You know what movie taught me what a suit of plate armor would do was Excalibur, because as a kid, you don't think too much. You're like, oh, a knight, and you just imagine that the sword would go through whatever. And then I'm watching Excalibur, and these guys are like hitting each other with swords and just banging into and just bent into the armor. I was like, oh my god, that is horrible. you know, so it is a brutal way of fighting.
You're largely impenetrable to standard weaponry unless somebody can get through the joints of the armor.
Yeah, which had to suck wearing it. Like if you really wore metal like that, that would suck. You'd have to be real strong, and you'd have to put up with a lot of heat. I don't know. It seemed like you really would have to. I mean, that's a warrior commitment right there, you know. But what I was gonna say, the reason I wasn't trying to go one direction. What I was trying to do is, from a storytelling standpoint, why something might not work, why that might deteriorate the story. And I was thinking, it's like if I meet people from like multiple different religions, right? And I'm like, oh, what is this religion?
Politics and religion. What are you trying to do to me, Doug? Go ahead, continue. I'm kidding. I know. I'm just being a jerk.
We've all experienced this where we're like, oh, you're from a different religion, and you ask like, well, what is? And they tell you, and it's always a fascinating discussion. You're like, oh, that's very interesting. So it's like that's one way to like introduce a new idea. Imagine if you had like 4 of these people or 3 people, and one person tells you about their religion, and the other person tells you about yours or theirs, and you're like, oh, that's fascinating. And then the third person goes, I'm going to tell you, and by the end, you will be converted. Now I'm like, probably not. Now I'm on defense. So I feel like that's what this messaging is like in these films these days. It's like as if you should be converted by the way we say this. And it's like, well, once you introduce this as an absolute, I think as a viewer, I can't get on board with it because you've told me that there is no other option now. And you told me there's no other way to think about this issue. And I think that that's fundamentally anti-artistic. And when you introduce it, you have an anti-artistic element in something that's meant to be artistic.
It's also insulting the intelligence of the audience. It's not allowing. Right. It's not trusting them to come to a conclusion on their own. Or rather, you are so invested in the conclusion that you want the audience to make that you are not able to leave that to chance, I guess.
Well, believe it or not, I think that
sometimes
good
you
writing...
can just get locked inside your own head, though. I'm sorry to interrupt, Doug. Like,
no worries.
There was a friend of mine whose name I will not speak because I don't want to. I won't say his name because this is a recent exchange that we had, and I'm going to be vague about it. But he's writing something, and he came to me and said, he was having difficulty describing the size of something, right? It was a small thing, and eventually he settled on, let me just say small, and I'll leave it to the audience to figure out how big it was, because he wanted to go about, well, what about 1 foot by 1 foot, or what about this, or about that. He was kind of going back and forth with how to describe something that was so small, and then he was just like, you know what, let me just trust the audience. I'll just say it's small, and they can have it. And I think that sometimes it's a matter of the author or the director or the screenwriter kind of getting stuck inside their own head and trying to communicate exactly what their vision is. And it's a little bit more difficult with screenwriting because you have to be visual. But I think that there, especially in a modern film, it's it's kind of fallen by the wayside to trust the audience with regard to what you're communicating or the idea, or just maybe even not what you're communicating, but just letting them have it. You know what I mean? Just letting them have it. Maybe it can be, maybe the speculation can be broad enough so that different messages can be surmised by different individuals. That's totally fine. Those are the types of movies that I prefer. Cause like I say, I can like really dig my teeth into those. Like you can consider things. You can weigh other people's considerations. It becomes a conversation instead of just a story, which is important. Stories are important, and I'm not poo-pooing that, but a story with a conversation that follows, in my opinion, is more valuable than just the story.
The art of subtext is sadly underemployed nowadays.
Absolutely, yes.
Well, and what you said is pretty important, that the idea that a conversation that comes out of the story has perhaps even greater value than the story is pretty profound, because my theory has always been that storytelling is a survival mechanism. You know, when you see a Native American tribe, or like when we were watching the Northmen, they're surrounded, you know, same thing. They're around a bonfire. They're telling stories. And those stories are meant to warn you, or to teach you, or to give you a model to follow, or to understand complex things that you might encounter. You know, so it becomes a survival thing to read and understand the story and process it in order to go out and apply the message inside those stories.
Yes, storytelling is an essential part of being a human being.
Yeah,
that's how we communicate. That's how we elicit emotion, which is how it is an essential part to being a human being. Storytelling is likely the most important thing that humans do.
Well, and there's even all this like neuroscience now that say our brains are actually wired to process things through narrative. That's why dreams, as incoherent as they might be, still take on this element. It's so fun. To this day, I love listening to people try to tell me their dream. They're like, so I was in this place. I don't know how I got there. And they're still trying to make sense of it. And there is no sense to it. And yet they will still say, I think it means something. And what's even weirder is they're probably right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, well, there's a lot of well, I don't want to come across as an expert, but I find
neuroscience
and neuroscientific research fascinating, and there is quite a bit of research that indicates that just in our everyday, just day-to-day humdrum, non-narrative lives, we still view it in a narrative framework with ourselves as the central character. It's just the human relation to the world, and it is what sets us apart from any other creature on the planet. No other creature tells stories.
That and thumbs.
All other. Well, I mean, really. Where are other life forms that have thumbs?
I know.
Few.
There are many other life forms that have thumbs.
Yes. Raccoons, apes, whatever. But the idea is that, like, there are plenty of other life forms that communicate. In fact, every other life form on the planet communicates in some fashion, at least within its own kind. Whether it's just by pheromones, or whether it's by actions, or
even body motions, like
body motions. Exactly. I was just
dance.
Exactly thinking of bees as well. Like bees dance, and that we don't know how they understand each other, but they do. But they don't tell stories. All other communication outside of human narrative communication, human storytelling, all other communication is functional. It is meant to impart either warning or procreative
or wisdom,
impulse, or territory, or like there are some concrete function of that communication going on, even if we as humans can't decipher it, like with whale song, say.
Right.
But it's not a story. It is not a relation of things that didn't actually happen for the purpose of eliciting emotions and then taking those responses into future situations, right?
Right. Well, these are models, and
Yeah.
I think an effective story is supposed to show you the conflict, the problem, right? Here's the problem. Here's the scenario. Here's all the things related to it. And the more you can box all that in to your reader, they're going to be like, "Oh man, how are they going to get out of this?" To see how they get out of it, even if they fail and they don't get out of it, still gives you information.
Yeah.
Yes.
It gives you a chance to sort of process it and be like, there's something there that I can use if I were ever in a situation. I remember, I think I've mentioned this in the past, when I hit like a really tough spot after the 2008 housing market crisis, realizing that Luke Skywalker at the end of Empire Strikes Back, is dismembered and he's hanging from like a pole at the bottom. Like, it's pretty crappy situation. And to realize that he's let me tell you, it's called A New Hope. But he still gave me a model for what it means to re-engage, because I had gotten to a point where I remember I was like, why bother building anything ever again if everything I build just falls apart? It's nothing I can do now makes sense or has the same type of value. I'd lost confidence, I guess, and faith and so when I was researching both the hero's journey and Star Wars, I was like, so the hero has to face disgrace. Like this has to happen. There's incredible wisdom in there. They didn't tell me how to get out of a housing market financial crisis that I was in, which is very specific, but they let me know enough about the idea of dismemberment, and disgrace and re-engagement was all embedded in there. And that was enough to help me grab a hold of something in that story and understand what that there had to be a coming back process that I had to initiate. And the value of that is incredible.
Yeah, that's the reason that a hero is because it's somebody that we can look up to. Yeah, they're not necessarily experiencing the exact situation I am in my life, but
right,
how they had it so much worse and they still stood up and took this action, or they did this thing and they responded in some way. They didn't let it just roll over them.
Well, now, Sable, I understand you are studying to be a Jedi, though, so there's some parallel.
Well, let's not get that around. We don't want any.
One of these days, you'll have to
I don't know, man. Sable, that's a pretty dark-sided name, though, right? Sableist. We better watch you if that's the case.
Maybe so.
Maybe Darth Phoenix.
But I think, not to put thoughts into your head or words into your mouth, James, but one of the things that I was just wondering if you were thinking about this film and having Doug's commentary on it because of how related to the Heroine's Labyrinth a lot of it seems to be.
You read my mind. I actually want to ask Doug. That's what we were coming up on. Because we have a hard out at 11 o'clock. The answer to your question, Sable, directly is yes. Okay. And I would actually like to ask that question of Doug and maybe just give him the floor to sort of,
unpack the film from that.
Yeah, unpack the Heroine's Labyrinth in context of the film. Honestly, Doug, I've been meaning to do this every time we've had a conversation. And sometimes the conversation just gets out of control. You know what I mean? It's like right now we're talking more in generality and about, the reason that human beings tell stories and whatnot is it's almost completely removed from the specific movie, The Last Duel. And because our conversations happen to be like that and their stream of consciousness, I didn't see an opening to ask you about this, but Sable has provided the perfect opening. So I would love for you to unpack that with regard to this. I think it's actually a really good candidate for this particular exercise.
Well, it is because for a couple reasons. One, the characters essentially stay in one place. Now, there are warrior tropes in this. They're unmistakable warrior tropes. and they're specific to a certain conflict, between England and France. I think this is the 100 Years' War. So you do have a warrior motif there, specifically with what's his name?
Carouge?
Eamon.
Carouge.
Yeah, Jacques de Carouge.
Yeah, Carouge. Yeah, right. Exactly. So you have this idea of leaving home, departing, and everything. But as far as the way The Last Duel is told, most of the conflict occurs at home, like on home turf.
Yes.
You have what I would call you can always identify the labyrinth when you look for rules, either real or the written rules or the unwritten rules about how the society is supposed to function that boxes in your quote structural heroine. And you definitely have this.
Yes.
And I would say because they open Act 1 or Chapter 1 with Sir Jean de Carouge, whether they like it or not, we actually start to sympathize with him, I think, the most in this story. I think we generally look at Degree as the villain, and I think we are generally sympathetic toward Marguerite, and I think it's mostly because we imprint on his point of view in that first chapter.
Yes.
And I think this creates some dissonance in the story, actually, because
it absolutely does. Because
you settle in with de Carouge, and then you're like, well, now he's kind of a pompous prick, and you're like, oh, I kind of liked him. He seemed pretty honorable to me.
Yes.
And then you see it from her perspective, and you're like, he's just as dumb and arrogant because he's a man, just like Degree, and you're like, oh man, I don't know who to cheer for. I'm definitely sympathetic toward Marguerite, but so it creates some dissonance. My main point was he is in some ways a structural heroine as well, because we start with him, we kind of lead off with him. And he has certain rules about property, about, in fact, he's very legalistic. He sues everybody all the time.
Extremely legalistic. Yeah. Yep.
So he's very, he's very aware of and very active with these rules that box you in. And oddly, he's kind of on the outs with it. So I always talk about the Scarlet Letter, being kind of a problem when the heroine runs into a problem with her native culture. The risk is that if she doesn't play her cards right, that she can become stigmatized. Mm-hmm. And I would say that Jean de Carouge definitely faces this stigma problem. He's kind of outcast in his society. In fact, she says at one point, I think she uses the phrase, "We're no longer welcome at court."
Right.
And that's a key phrase for this idea of the Scarlet Letter. You are socially unwelcome. We have a negative opinion of you because you have not played by our rules. You're suing your lord. What kind of an idiot does that, right?
There's a measure of him having done this to himself, though. And so the reason is because when we go back to the bridge that he's supposed to be holding, right? So this is the one time, I think, in the film where we see him deviate from what is the law. He was told not to move because they had to defend the land or whatever it was, the fort, wherever they were. It was unclear to me, and I haven't read the book. And so he moves from that to protect innocent people. And I think that is also a very, very large reason why we side with him initially. Because he goes, the king's word be damned. We're doing this, to say, well, he actually says for the king, right. Because in his interpretation, if the king were there witnessing the slaughter, he would have relented and said, okay, yes, go, please save the innocents.
Which is a moral appeal.
Yes, it is a moral appeal. And so because there's that moral appeal in the beginning, we side with him also because he is abandoning his legalism in that moment. He takes it up and is way more strongly reinforced throughout the rest of the film because he knows that when he did that one thing that wasn't following the rules, it turned his life to shambles.
Well, but it does. Now that you bring that up, I think that's a great point because it does underscore that he's a man of honor, right? He made it. That move to defend the bridge after they killed those women was a moral decision. It was specifically a non-tactical decision. In fact, the way the story and I think history frames it, it was an ill-advised.
Extremely ill-advised because they lost. They lost. Yeah.
Yeah, this was a bad move. But he stands by it because of his moral imperative.
From his point of view, the moral
From his point of view.
Yeah, yeah.
From a certain point of view.
This also reminds me.
Well,
Go
real
ahead.
quick, I'll just bookmark it. But my point is, you do have a labyrinth here. He's not navigating actual corridors, but he's
Right.
very clearly navigating cultural blocks. And he runs into these walls and dead ends in almost every version of the events of the
Yes.
story. So he is dealing with a labyrinth scenario of his native culture. His native culture is where the problem's coming from,
Mhm.
more so than the English army. You know,
Yeah, the English don't actually represent an existential threat to France, or at least to their part of France in Normandy at this time.
Yes.
Right. This is more of one. It's almost like a Cold War. You know, they're just constantly exchanging blows for 100 years almost. Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, but my point is, like, there's definitely a labyrinth motif there. You don't get it. Although it is in the story that there is a warrior hero who leaves home to go fight a foreign enemy. Although that's there, that is not the central drama of what drives the conflict in the story. And that what does drive the conflict of the story is homegrown cultural rules, legal rules. And he is actually very interesting because he fights on that level. You know, most heroines are much more at odds. You know, the rules are kind of a mystery to them at first, and they kind of figure it out. He kind of is like, hey, I know this game, and I'm going to fight you with this game. To his own detriment, I think, as you said, James. So, and also the Masked Minotaur, a social apex character who wields a lot of social power, who is outwardly benevolent, or at least has social status and standing, but is secretly tyrannical. I would say is Ben Affleck's character. God, I'm having terrible time with these names.
You're talking about Count Pierre?
Pierre,
Yeah.
Count Pierre. That's right.
Yeah, Count Pierre.
And then I knew that one. I don't know why I tried to look that up. But and I wouldn't say he's necessarily tyrannical, necessarily, but he's like a libertine, right? They portray him as a libertine, so he's obviously got this animalistic, debauched side. He did take the estate and give it to the squire, and you do get a sense of duplicity shared. I would say the duplicitous side is shared more with Degree. You know, he's the friend who's not such a friend. And what's interesting is they play that very straight. They portray him as an ally a lot in the film, even though we tend to not like him the whole time. It's really weird how they pulled that one off. Another thing that I did notice in this was the chamber guardians and the inner chambers.
Oh, yeah.
The idea of going into an inner chamber, and you get the exact motif. I always look. It's someone behind a desk, and even though it was outdoors in this one setting that I'm thinking of, he goes there to plead his case, and you have everyone sitting behind the desk in that classic standoff. And of course, he fails the social test there and it kind of storms off, which weakens his stand. He threatens to sue him in that scene. So, he
also comes across as impetuous, so it also affects his honor in having
right. It's unbecoming of someone who's supposed to be noble. You know, especially when he's accusing someone as a lowly squire of being, lower than him purely based on hierarchy. You know, he calls him, he's like, "You're just a squire." But back then that mattered. You know, in a lot of history, those kind of hierarchies were very, very rigid and very important. But the other one that I wanted to mention that I think is very important, especially in this one, is home is battleground, because it pertains specifically to the heroine of the story, Marguerite. The idea of the home invasion is 100% portrayed here. In my opinion, the Masked Minotaur role is kind of shared between Pierre and between Degree. They kind of both operate together, I would say, as a dual villain in a sense. And he's the one who invades her not just her home, but her most inner sanctum, which is the bedroom. So, you know, and they depict it multiple times, to show you this invasion of the inner sanctum. And the one thing I thought was kind of bizarre and compelling, I guess, is that even in Degree's account of this home invasion that he is in, where his version of he's invited, he's following her signals and he's invited in, he still kind of assaults her pretty. I mean, he rapes her. Even
Absolutely.
in his version of the account, it's pretty clear that it's not a willing partner. So even in
that particular aspect of the film is extremely ambiguous. It is extremely unambiguous from every angle. Man, I'll get it out eventually. Good God.
He said, but his basic position is, I was still invited. She did her customary.
She protested as a lady should, but we both enjoyed
customary
it.
Protest.
Yeah.
But the home invasion, I would say, is a huge one. And there's probably more. Believe it or not, when I watched this, I watched it from just a pure straight viewing standpoint. I was not necessarily trying to break that, but I couldn't help but notice some of them without trying to, without a deep analysis. So some of them jumped out at me right away, like they're unmistakable. And when I see them, I have cues like the desk. The desk confrontation is always a dead giveaway, and we had that here. And I would even argue the trial itself is a Chamber Guardian scenario on steroids.
He was approaching people behind. Carouge was approaching people behind desks very frequently throughout the film. When he was working out the details of the dowry, the father was behind a desk, or at least the table.
Yeah, another one.
Pierre and Legree were behind a desk when he was being awarded the guardianship of Carouge's family home. I'll call it a family. That's not what it was. So they were behind a desk then. There's the court. They are all behind. It's a huge desk that everyone's behind, and it's kind of him versus everyone else. So these people are all, and it's not just the legal system; it's also public opinion. So he's sort of pleading his case or her case to public opinion as well as the legality of the day. There were very, very many desks that he ended up approaching. When he went to go get paid, there was a dude behind the desk.
That's right.
So their desks all over the place.
And that's a classic one. And I would even argue that, or a case could be made at least, at the dinner table, his wife's mother was antagonistic toward him in a sense.
Yes.
At the table. So, she was there to deliver certain messages too, and it was the anti-message to the heroine. She even makes the case that, hey, I was raped and I just got over it. That is an antithetical message to Marguerite.
Yes, that's when she says. That's when the actual message of the film is spoken. The truth doesn't, or at least the message of Rashomon is spoken when she says the truth doesn't matter. And it is an antithetical message. Apologies for the interruption. Go ahead.
No. It was a perfect interruption. But so anyway, there are those strong elements there, and I did not look. You could argue that the Black Swan. Was there any? I mean, I always, I sometimes look at it as warfare. Something that that upturns the social order from the outside. So sometimes wars can do that. I don't know if that really.
Well, the fact that Jean's mother took all the servants for her day out when she shouldn't have.
Yeah, that looks shady.
Left the whole situation, left Marguerite and the entire keep vulnerable.
See, that to me seems more in line with a cult of deception. That there is an agenda at work. That actually, now that you say it, that is suggestive. That the mother-in-law.
And speaking of suggestive, I almost kind of in Marguerite's chapter, I almost got that implication. Also, I don't know if either of you guys picked up on this implication, but her best friend, who then kind of rejects her after she makes the claims of rape. what did either of you get the implication that that her best friend had actually had an affair with Degree, and that's why she was pregnant, and that's why she rejected Marguerite?
I didn't get that, but I wouldn't. I mean,
it's there.
It would have been it's very subtle, but I think that it's possible. I think that was.
Well, and writers will put that in there. There are things in my book that I set up, but I never tell anybody, and I like it that way. Like, maybe I'll bring it up, I'll mention what I did, but you put it in there anyway because it's functional, but you don't waste time or spend time, I should say, in the story developing that part of the functionality. But it's there.
I'm not necessarily willing to give this movie the benefit of that doubt. I don't think that it was that clever.
Yeah.
Well, and it might not have been.
That's just me. And, I could be dead wrong, but, you asked my opinion, that's my opinion.
Absolutely.
I'm trying to make the film more interesting, honestly. So maybe I was overstretching it.
And it's not, look, this is all subjective, right? Like, I think film has been around for a very long time, and I think that it's generally understood that the message that you can glean out of any specific film doesn't have to be the same thing as someone else. It doesn't even have to be the intended message of the director. So
100%.
like, it's all subjective. And if you're reading things in, you're reading things in. I think in some cases that's not necessarily like, so Jax had shared a story with me, and the trueness of the story is actually sort of speaks to the message itself. So Akira Kurosawa, he is fielding a whole bunch of questions. It's like a Q&A sort of a thing. After it was one of his historical pieces. It was either definitely one of his historical pieces or definitely not one of his historical pieces. I have to ask Jax the story again. But there was someone who asked a question, and they're like, "Oh, well, how did you know the framing for this scene is so perfect? How did you know how to do this and the evocation and the implication and blah blah blah? And how did you how did that come to you?" And his answer was literally, "Hospital goes here, highway goes here." Because that's the only way that the shot could have been done, because that's where the hospital was and that's where the highway was. So there can be a danger. I say danger. It's not really a danger. There can be a sort of undermining air to reading too far into something.
Oh, no, it happens. Yeah.
But generally speaking, it's subjective. So, I'm just not willing to be that. I'm not willing to give the film the benefit of that.
I know what you mean, James. Like, in the hands of it, like in The Northman, you get a sense that everything's intentional.
Yes, absolutely.
And I
believe it is.
Right. You defer to that's supposed to be there. Yes. Whereas in this one with Ridley Scott, hit or miss, I think it's perfectly reasonable to be skeptical. To be skeptical, because like I said, he plays fast and loose with certain things, whereas I do prefer a little bit more deliberateness out of filmmakers or storytellers when you're doing that, when you're trying to add layers of functionality or archetypal messaging in there. It should, as you unpack it should hold up.
Yes, I agree. But I have to correct myself real quickly. I may have accidentally said she in reference to Jax. I meant to say them. I apologize. So I'm correcting myself publicly. But go ahead.
Right on. Well, I was going to say that there is I think it is implied. I think this is a little bit more intentional, that the mother-in-law may have conspired with Degree, because they make it a point to say how she took all the servants, which sounded very unusual and atypical, to clear that place out. And he shows up at that exact time to do his assault. So it's all very well coordinated, or there's an impression that this was a coordinated effort. So to me,
cui bono? Why? What was the benefit?
I don't know. Well, she clearly wasn't on anybody's side. She seemed to be very she didn't like Matt Damon's character, or Jean de Carouge, did she?
Well, she did blame him for them losing the fort in the first place and her having to relocate.
Yeah, maybe the mother-in-law actually thought that it would have been a better match to be with the cunning degree. I don't know, but they definitely spent enough time letting you know that some groundwork or some other events had to take place for this assault to work, and that it was an unusual circumstance. So again, maybe not, but that lends itself toward that idea of a cult of deception, the idea of an active agenda on a larger scale that the structural heroine is unaware of and dealing with the evidence of as they go through the story. So anyway, I think those are some of the most prominent ones that stuck out in my mind. And then I think there is a little bit of atonement at the end, but I think that the atonement is kind of like the call to adventure. It's more of a storytelling device that is going to show up, whether you're in a hero's journey or a heroine's labyrinth or something else. I think you're going to have you need your characters to reconcile the conflicts of the story. So I'll actually scrap that one. The other ones I mentioned, I think, are a little bit more direct archetypal reflections that show up in the story.
Okay.
I think that they could have made the Sacred Fire a lot more central to the story too, if they had rearranged the way that the chapters were told. Like if they'd told Degree's chapter first and made a point of how, like, he obviously was in bed with Count Pierre, figuratively and sometimes literally, as they went to sample all the pleasures of the flesh that they had access to as the count of Normandy, right? And him being the right hand of the Count of Normandy. He had no shortage of women, but what set Marguerite aside to him was how intelligent she was, right? She was literate and conversant in multiple languages,
multilingual,
and maybe it would have been better to then follow that up with Marguerite's chapter to show that she also has the same capability with numbers and accounting and running complex enterprises and keeping the books straight. Like, she did the same thing to Jacques de Carouge's estate that Degree did for
that's
Pierre,
a good one, yeah.
Right? So that, like, they brush over that parallel. Like, they showed the parallel, but it's not made as much of a driving or a motivating factor as it could have been, and would have made it stronger. And that would have absolutely been the Sacred Fire archetype.
Well, and now that you say it, it would have been easy. Just show her in a library reading or doing the abacus. Like, you don't need to spend a lot of time to show us that she has this aspiration on some level, or this skill or this talent, something she had to learn and master. And secondly, that's a good point. And by the way, the Sacred Fire is very important. And I just realized something that was sitting right in front of my face. That is, I would say, central to the entire story. That is a Heroine's Labyrinth issue. So the belly of the beast in the hero's journey is a symbolic death. And that is a very critical stage, archetypally speaking, in a maturation process. You must undergo the death in order to undergo the transformation, which is part of the re-engagement, knowledgeable re-engagement at this point. Heroine's Labyrinth features something called the poisoned apple, which is a symbolic rape. And I remember when we were discussing Faraway Bird, for some reason during the conversation, I got lost and I was like, what is this? The poisoned apple? And I was like, oh my God, poisoned apple is actual rape. Actual taking of the Sacred Fire by a sexual assault is the most primal, the most blatant, the most overt version of the archetype. That's what this entire story is about. He takes the Sacred Fire from her. And to your point, Sable, what attracts him to her? That skill level, her intelligence, her Sacred Fire. That's what draws him into her. And that's what he tries to use as a wedge to distinguish himself from her husband. He's like, he doesn't appreciate all this stuff about you, but I do. So you're absolutely right. He is attracted to that Sacred Fire, which they did not develop. They did develop it, but they did not. It was rather brief. It was more tell, don't show.
It was
But
almost a footnote. Like it should have been the whole point.
yeah, the more you
Make it
make
stronger.
me think about it, they should have started with chapter 3 and not said anything about the truth
Potentially.
and just
Yeah.
told that story. And really
Yeah, if they were going to do chapters, either chapter 2 or chapter 3, it would have been the one to start with. You should have either inverted the film completely or at least swapped it out so Degru's perspective was told first, and we were set up with, oh, this is the guy that we should be sympathizing with up until he assaults.
Well,
And even then, if you present it as if you present it well enough that he really actually believes that she's leading him on, well, then you set up that kind of ambiguity for the following chapters, and then you really lean into that unreliable narrator thing.
The story that they tried to tell, the truth, makes sense only now that I think about it, and now I'm becoming more decisive about it. It only makes sense through chapter 3. It should have been told to her point of view. And think about this structurally, I could graft this onto the Heroine's Labyrinth almost flawlessly if we did that. Because you would develop her sacred fire. She has these abilities, these talents, this level of intelligence, this witticism about her. This it's an attractive force, right? It's a creative power. It's an attractive force, and this is what. And she does have a captivity bargain. She's literally in a tower. She even retreats up those stairs.
Yeah.
So you literally have her locked in a castle, which is almost classic medieval folktale version of this. You have and at that point, then you would be able to, as a writer, recast or focus or develop Sir Jean de Carouge as the Beast's ally, because that is what he is. Remember, I said the Beast's ally is the Heroine's Labyrinth version of the knight in shining armor.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's like perfect. He is a knight in shining armor, exactly like a literal version of that. So, and what does he do? He adopts the heroine's cause, and that's what the Last Duel is all about. He's willing to die to fight for her cause. So, this actually, now that I think about it, now that I'm actually grafting all of this on there, they should not have done the
Rashomon treatment. Yeah,
they should not have done that.
No, they shouldn't have, especially.
Yeah, if
you know how I feel about this. I could go on and on.
If they wanted to flirt with it, they should have done it through testimony.
Yeah,
like you would in a courtroom drama. If they wanted to do that,
yeah, for sure.
Right. So anyway, I'm realizing that this does actually follow it more severely than I thought, because then you would have a beast as ally in Sir Jean de Carouge. My French is terrible. But actually, all of these line up perfectly if you recenter the story on her, like unapologetically. Like,
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you could explore the themes. Like, there are certain themes that he clearly wanted to explore with regard to Carouge and how he was using this idea of trial by combat as an excuse. Like, he was using her rape as an opportunity to get back at someone who he views had slighted him.
Yeah, on some level, that's undeniable.
Right. And so, like, you could definitely do a lot more with that. If you would just tell the story start to finish like it is. This, like, it was just it was indelicate. It was ham-fisted, specifically with regard to its comparison to Rashomon. I'm not saying that it's not an enjoyable film.
Right.
It's difficult to watch at times, for sure. Like, there are some scenes that aren't enjoying or entertaining, but it's, as a film, it's, I'm not taking everything away from it. Only most things. Only, the theme, which is a big
well, what's weird is I've noticed that by studying the Heroine's Labyrinth, sometimes I'm like, actually this story is all we're doing is we're just focused on the beast as ally. And that's why it's male centric, but really he's adopting her cause. And we have, like, Han Solo and Luke Skywalker, they adopt the heroine's cause in A New Hope. In this one, the whole Last Duel is based on the fact that he is fighting for her honor, which, to your point, there's that there is a line of duplicity there that he's also fighting for his honor.
Oh yeah.
But technically, the Last Duel, I think legalistically is tied to the rape charges. So
Yes.
So in
And that's that's interesting too. Just to touch on that, they almost make that explicit in the film, because in chapter 1, towards the end, when he's talking with his friends and family and couriers and whatever, and saying, "Spread this tale, tell it to anyone who will listen. I have a plan." And then in chapter 3, which is Marguerite's recollection or recounting of the event, supposedly, he's in that same scene, and then he says, "We have a plan," which is very interesting.
Interesting. That is interesting.
That he is actually, despite being presented as more brutish and demanding and uncaring in chapter 3, once he steps forward and starts trying to manipulate the system to give them this one shot at quote unquote justice, or at least revenge, is that he actually seems to be more supportive of her, right? And more invested in, like you said, taking up her cause rather than being there for his own, like pursuing his own honor, his own.
Well,
I'm not willing to go that far with it, because that scene is on the heels of their.
It's not just that one either. Like that's the point where it a little bit shifts, and that particular choice in dialogue stood out to me for that reason.
Well, no, you
well,
are.
It's not
the context of that scene is the lead-in is their final bedroom scene of the whole film, where he says, "I refuse to let him be the last man who did that with you." And so that transitions into them having a plan. So I'm not like, at that point, it's like, I know there's really,
but that's a degrading comment to her, and it's self-exalting to him. It makes him look bad, I would say.
Yes, absolutely makes him look bad. But because the lead into them having a plan is that scene, it's not.
It undermines that. Yeah.
I think that he's just saying, we, as a matter of course, not necessarily, I'm sure, Doug, that there are times where you'll say the word "we" speaking for your family. I say the word "we" speaking for Candace. She does it for me as well. So
we don't always do that.
No, not always. I get it. The lead into that scene, and then the context of him wanting his primary goal is revenge. It's not to defend her honor. It's not, at least in my read. And people have different reads, but I think that critically, the reason that we were shown his story from the beginning and that we side with him from the beginning is because the filmmaker knew that at the end we were going to be rooting for him, because his victory meant her life. So they needed to give us something to root for. And we already know that the accounts are not necessarily accurate. Even Marguerite's own account, even though it hung on the truth when the chapter started, we've seen throughout that chapter that her account isn't necessarily flawless. There are things that we saw her say in her own account that she just in court gets incorrect, and so I do not see him in that light. He's not delicate or gentle. I don't think he's fighting for her honor at all.
I'm not saying that it is. I'm not saying that he is delicate. I'm not saying that they're trying to portray him in a positive light per se.
Well, there is a Heroine's Labyrinth.
It's just that she's recognizing, like, why would she have any particular investment in portraying him in that particular light, given that he presented it himself as if it was all his own plan.
Well, there is a Heroine's Labyrinth.
She's recalling it as, okay, he's making this inclusive about our entire family.
Because someone has been speaking for her for the entire film. She has stood by while other people have spoken for her for the whole film. And so her account of his voice is him speaking for her. She had nothing to do with it. She didn't plan this at all. In fact, when she finds out her life is on the line, she's absolutely disgusted. And so her account is the read that, her father has been speaking for her, Carouge has been speaking for her, Legree took her voice away in a very real way. And so now, again, her husband is also speaking for her. That's my read on it.
So there is the Heroine's Labyrinth analysis of this is that there is a doppelganger effect between the Beast as ally and the Masked Minotaur. So to the heroine, both are half man, half animal.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that the humanity is more dominant in the Beast and the animal is more dominant in the Minotaur. The Minotaur is the unreconciled individual. So there is a sense that he's just as bad as the villain. He's just a little bit better. And I think that's kind of, now in a more heartwarming story, not only is the humanity more dominant in the Beast, it's so dominant that he's endearing, right? He's dashing. Mm-hmm. He's a very good guy and we really like him. But there is this, that to me, that sounds like a feminine warning that even the Beast as ally has similarities to the Masked Minotaur, so you get that doppelganger effect.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Interesting.
I want to add in something that I think could have both enhanced the Heroine's Labyrinth approach, and also could have enhanced the ambiguity of the different perspectives if they were. Obviously, that's not what they were trying to do, even though they presented it that way for the first 2/3 of the film.
Right.
But if they had been fully committed to that, then it would have been better if they had actually included some more historical accuracy. Two main things stood out to me, because this is one of those films where I was like, oh, I now want to go and find out more about this. So I went and did research about these people and the events.
The record, so did I, and I think that's to its credit.
It is absolutely.
Even though I got things wrong, it is absolutely to its credit that inspired me to know.
I think at the end of the film, they imply that they just have the one child, and then Jacques however it's pronounced.
Jacques Legree.
No. Jean
de Carouge. Yeah, it's de Carouge and Legree. And man, oh man, those French and their names.
Anyway,
not easy.
So Jean de Carouge then goes off into one of the Crusades and is killed. And they just leave it at that. Then they also say that that Marguerite had many years happily running the estate or whatever. And well, okay, I guess the family just faded into obscurity after that point and kind of just vanished out of the historical record. Mm-hmm. But what we do know is that after the duel, they actually had 2 more children before Carouge left to the Crusades and never came back. And then when he died, it passed to his at the time his eldest was 10 years old, I believe. Thomas was his name, or I forget. But say what you will. I mean, obviously there were all sorts of property laws surrounding marriage anyway, and what have you. So it's not like the women had a whole lot of say in producing heirs. That was or producing children. That's what they were there for. That was kind of their main role in a marriage in the first place. But at the same time, that gives a little bit of a different flavor to the ending, different context to the ending, right? That could have enhanced, once again, the ambiguity of who's right, who's not, who's really a bad person, who's not. Also, perhaps even more critically, the land that they had the initial legal disputes over, that he sued the estate, the count, that section of the estate of his father-in-law's estate, that he was like, yeah, this one right here, I want this one.
With the big red outline.
With a big outline, exactly, because it's the most valuable part of the estate, right? Well, that land in history, that land had not been confiscated for the payment of tax debt. that land had been bought by Count Pierre for 8,000 livres. It was an open legal contract, and there is implication that one of the reasons that Jean wished to marry Marguerite in the first place was to try and leverage the relationship as an legal in to try and dispute the claim of that particular piece of land. So he is less of an aggrieved party and more of a cagey political animal in reality.
Interesting.
Very, very interesting.
And I just thought, okay, there, not only are you leaving certain things out, but then you're changing part of the story to make Degree more of a villain than he was, right? Because he's like, hey,
well, because he was the rapist,
right? So it's like, okay, let's pile it on and make the case, quote unquote, more and more damning against him versus Jean. When if you,
I don't really need that.
To,
like, I didn't really need
yeah.
Dude, he did in all accounts, including his own.
Yeah.
Yes.
This woman.
No.
I didn't need him to be any worse than that. I have a very strong opinion.
And I would even argue that they tried to make him appear rather friendly and supportive of Carouge in many scenes. I felt like they portrayed him sympathetically for at least half of the film.
Yeah, they did, absolutely. And I'm just saying it would have, if you were going to commit to the supposed ambiguity, then tell the people more true to their real life counterparts, right? Because obviously,
I agree.
Obviously, Ducarouge is not quite so wronged and maybe not quite so brutish as he's portrayed in the film. Obviously, he was a shrewd political animal at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, doesn't mean he's a better or worse person. It just makes him, I think, more interesting than the way he's presented. And the same for Degree. That it's not, as Bacon was saying, he's already committed an act, or will commit an act that we will not forgive him for, that we will not conscience.
Mm-hmm.
So why do we have to try and make him seem like the one plotting behind the scenes and using legalities and power structures in order to acquire what he wants?
My impression of him while watching this was that he was still a bro, to Carouge. It's just that he got this lucky break to get it in with the Lord, with Pierre, and why turn that down? And then Carouge didn't like that because he felt left. So it felt a little bit more like unfortunate circumstances that kind of started to divide them.
Yes,
until he saw the wife, and that's when he
But there's again using implication. There's the implication that the reason he got gifted that land in the first place was because he was the one who implemented the program to go out and collect the debt in the first place, right? And then he leaned on the guy to give up a land that was worth twice the debt he owed. So it's like the implication, and maybe again I'm giving the film too much credit. The implication was that he was engineering that entire situation because he was saying, "Hey, that's some pretty nice land right there, and if it's in the hands of Pierre, maybe I can end up getting it to, getting the good fortune."
But then how is that any different from what Carouge was doing to try to angle for that land for his benefit?
Well, that's what I'm saying is like they kind of flipped their historical.
Oh, I see what you're
on that. They why? What do you? We're already going to view Degree as the Degree the Gray as the villain because of what he does. Yeah, Jack the Gray. We're already going to view him as the villain because of what he does. So why do we have to heap it? Why do we have to heap it higher? Like, I don't know. In this kind of a film where there's no it's not a fantasy with a clear-cut archetype being played, character as archetype, like the Lord of the Rings, right? Lord of the Rings is very character as archetype.
Well, because you're dealing with fictional.
Because you're
totally, you're making them.
I mean that, but also it's the type of story that's being told. It's a very black and white. It's a very morally focused story. This one is as well, but it doesn't present itself as that, if that makes any sense. And also because it is based on real historical people are not in and of themselves archetypes. So they have a lot of different layers and directions that they go, different drives. They act one way in one situation, and then they act a different way that you would not expect given that previous situation in another. And it would have felt more authentic. I think it would have felt more realistic, and again would have given if you could also have used it in a way to enhance, if you really wanted to go the direction that neither one of these guys is really better than the other, except that one of them has a legal claim to do what he does and the other one just comes and takes it illegally by force.
One guy is better than the other.
One guy is definitely better than the other. It's like I'm political intrigue and social jockeying, and then the rape happens. It's like, well, there is a clear bad guy and there is a clear good guy. The good guy might be an a-hole. It's very clear.
But they present it as like when he takes her to bed, even though he has a right to because she's legally married to him.
No, I agree.
He's not any gentler or any more enjoyable for her than it was to have the Jack the Gray raper, right?
The idea there in that scene is that she was raped again.
Yeah, I'm not talking even in that one scene that you're referring to. I'm referring to every time he takes her to bed, right?
Oh yes, yeah, you're right.
No, I mean, so.
But to me, that vilifies him
chapter 3
of history. Like history didn't, this guy fought to the death in a rape case.
Yeah,
and then you said yourself that he had like kids with her. Like I feel like they made him look worse than he was in history.
Exactly. As far as we know from the records, they're demonizing him more than the records would indicate.
But see, to me, that's the intrusion of a modern lens.
Right.
I think there is a way, there is a thinking process or an interpretation of these events as no matter what, the male men in power will always be a problem, or men who have an upper hand or disproportionate power, let's say, are in and of that self presents a problem. I think that is the message in that interpretation, and to what you're saying is, well, but in order to make that point, you have to now do things to de-Carouge's character that don't even seem like they were part of the historical reality. But
you could have even taken the historically accurate.
Right. Now you could have.
You could have even enhanced that message, in my opinion, if you'd done it with any kind of artistry.
Which, from what you're saying, the writer should have focused on his political maneuvering.
Yeah.
Which is just as dehumanizing on some level, right?
Right. Yeah.
You don't need to make him a rapist at home in order to see.
To me, it was just some weird choices and weird omissions, and I was like, why? It was
indelicate.
It's indelicate. Why would you do it? It doesn't enhance the type of film you're trying to make, I don't think. So I don't follow the reasoning. And I thought it could have. There were ways, even just reading the historical accounts that are out there on the internet. Who knows how accurate those are? But if you had even followed those a little more accurately, you could have made it even potentially more interesting film, in my opinion. So. It would have been stronger in archetypes as well, because the Beast as ally is presented as such because he has in some ways equal power, if in different form, to the Minotaur, right? He can match him, and yes, at the end of this film, he does match him in force of arms, and they nicely alluded to this as well, I thought, because there was that one line where Jacques the Gris says, it wouldn't be wise to bet against John de Carouge in battle,
That's right.
Because he's like admitting that I might be bigger, I might be stronger, I might be more handsome, and I might have a better position at court.
But this guy knows how to win.
This guy's a pit bull, right? He knows how to win when it comes to violence. So they did give you a little bit of a premonition, I guess. In some ways, it kind of took me out of the tension of the ending fight, because I was like, oh, but it wouldn't be wise to bet against Jacques.
The more I think about it, if you were going to focus on her story, and let's say you were going to use the Heroine's Labyrinth to help kind of guide the thinking, it's very useful because you do have the doppelganger effect with these two. In fact, the fact that they duel over her and they seem equally matched is part of a doppelganger effect. They're two mirror images at war with each other. On just opposite sides of this issue. They're friends. They're, like you said, they were almost of equal, or they're effectively at equal stations. They both have social power in this place. So you could really work with the Beast as ally and the Masked Minotaur with the doppelganger aspect, because that's what makes the Beast compelling. Is he's, in my opinion, while studying these stories, it's like, well, he's like the Masked Minotaur, but he's different in some way. And this has all that. This has all of that. And you don't even need Pierre to be part of this story, really. Like, remember I said in the beginning that when I analyze this, it's like Pierre and Degree kind of share the Minotaur duties. Well, if you told it from her perspective, Pierre's not even really an issue. It's just Degree, and it's just Carouge, which would make more sense. It'd be easier to follow. And we wouldn't get bleach blonde Ben Affleck.
We wouldn't have to suspend so much disbelief.
We wouldn't get bull cut Affleck.
All right, guys, thank you so much. I want to be very careful of Doug's time. You're very generous with your time, Doug, so I don't want to keep you later than we should keep you. I do want to interject just this one last idea that I had that no place to present actually made itself apparent. So we were talking way earlier that Carouge was constantly approaching desks. Legree was constantly behind desks. Even in the times when he was like Pierre was even approaching him at a desk when he was, doing all the math and trying to write all the accounts.
Interesting.
So he was likely pulling double duty or maybe triple duty. But he was, I would think, I think we would call him a chamber guardian in at least some regard.
Right when you said that, I was like, so you have the Masked Minotaur as a chamber guardian. What does that mean, right? It makes me think that he is compromising. Like every chamber you enter, he's in it. He has positioned himself to block you out of everything. So I think there is a menacing factor if the Masked Minotaur plays that dual role, because it's like anywhere you go to find justice, he's sitting right there again.
He sure was.
It's compromised. So I think that's actually a great observation that he plays that dual role, because I do think there's meaning in that dual role.
Well, thank you. I think all my observations are great. So we're going to end there. No, I'm kidding.
I do too. Those are great.
Thank you both. I very much appreciate it. Looking forward to the next one. We'll figure out what we're going to do for the next one. It might be next week. It might be a week from now. We've had conversations behind the scenes about sort of maybe stretching the time period out, giving us all a little bit more time to watch a film, a little bit more time to, let life happen. So thank you all for watching, whether you're live in chat, whether you are watching on the replay. I appreciate everything. And
BGD
we'll guys.
RPG Exile. Good to see him.
Yes. And BGD. I missed saying hello to him in the beginning, and so I don't know if he's still here, but if he is, thank you and hello and goodbye. So I'm going to click end, and as is typical, it's going to hang around for a little bit before it actually ends. But thank you, everyone.
The stream, guys.
Bye, everybody.
Have a good night.